Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 11 lecture. So today we discuss Herman Melville, another important member of that American Renaissance group that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. So we've already covered Hawthorne, we've covered Poe, and then last week we made a slight detour into popular fiction of the mid-19th century. So I hope you guys enjoyed some of those texts that we sampled. We didn't get a chance to read a whole lot, but we just got some small examples of sentimental novels. Again, we're hopefully getting familiar with that genre by now. Very popular throughout the 19th century, as we've discussed. But we also saw an example of old Southwestern humor, which was very popular throughout the 1840s and 1850s. And we also read some kind of early journalism from Lydia Maria Child. She was really is often considered today to be one of our first modern journalists, and she kind of helped to pioneer the notion of the weekly newspaper column. That's kind of what she's doing with Letters from New York, but she's also tapping in to some of those same sentimental techniques, evoking strong emotions, much like we've seen in some of the sentimental literature that we've looked at this semester. So we've covered a lot of ground. This week, we get back into the Renaissance and one of the prime figures of that group, of that movement. So like I was talking about last week, when Matheson and these other scholars really defined the best of American literature and defined what the American literary canon would look like, they really zeroed in on this 5-year period between 1850 and 1855. And they said, okay, a lot of really important literary texts were produced during this period. So we've already mentioned a couple of the titles: Moby Dick, The Scarlet Letter, Leaves of Grass by Whitman, which we're getting to next week. But here this week, we're going to take a look at a couple of other selections by Melville, which were also published during that 5-year period. So Benito Cereno was published in 1855, and the Encantadas came out, I believe, in 1853. So they both fall within this same general time period. And again, Matheson and his contemporaries identified this period as a really fertile time for American literary production, as American writers were starting to emerge, not only domestically, but also we were gaining more of a reputation internationally. And also what Matheson really sort of focuses on with the Renaissance is, according to him, and again, this is sort of the master narrative of American lit that we've had for a long time, the idea is we now start to really get themes and subject matters that are recognizably American. We have authors like Melville, like Whitman, like Hawthorne, wrestling with American identity. What does it mean to be an American? What does, what do we do with our history? And here today with Melville, we're going to explore the history of slavery. A very thorny issue both then and now. How do we reconcile certain things about our history? How do we understand certain things about our history? So Matheson and his buddies thought that this group, this Renaissance group that we're covering, they were among the first writers to really do a lot of that kind of work. But again, we might push back on that. We might dispute that account, because I think Sedgwick was kind of wrestling with American identity. I think Charles Brockton Brown was, when they were writing back at the turn of the 19th century, or the earlier 19th century in the case of Sedgwick. So again, we traditionally overlooked a lot of the older American writers that we've already covered. In American literary studies, a lot of times Brown, Sedgwick, Child, certainly Foster, and some of the other early writers would have gotten glossed over, and we would have jumped right into the Renaissance. Nowadays, we try to give a little more coverage and a little bit more attention to the forerunners of the Renaissance generation, but now we're sort of in the heart of the Renaissance, and Melville remains an important literary figure, just like Hawthorne and Poe and Whitman, even as we've expanded the canon and we've added more authors, we've added a more diverse group of authors and a more diverse group of texts. Even as all of that's happened, we've continued to sort of keep these guys in the canon, in a lot of American literary syllabi, because they remain important and they're just sort of master craftsmen as well. But Melville typically is a challenge for a lot of students, both at the undergrad and graduate level. He's difficult. He can be very ambiguous. He's not necessarily an easy read. I find that some students will enjoy his prose most semesters. I always get a few that enjoy his style. Others can often grow frustrated by his style. It does require a little bit of patience. And we need to know a few things about Melville as well, because a little bit of an understanding of his biography will, I think, give us a better sense not only of American literary history, but also we can begin to understand why Melville made a comeback. Because he made a big comeback right after his death and in the decades following his death in the early 1890s. So as I mentioned last week, a sort of paradoxical thing about the Renaissance is that a lot of these authors during their time period were not wildly successful. That was true of Hawthorne, it's true of Melville, and it was only posthumously after they died that these authors, came to be celebrated and viewed as really important artists. To a lesser extent, that's even true of Poe. He became more popular after his death, and I would argue it's also true of Whitman, but we'll talk about him next week. So just a few biographical details about Melville. Kind of an interesting backstory. He was born into a pretty wealthy, privileged family in New York City. His father's family descended from a long line of prosperous merchants. His father was actually originally from New England. His father was descended from a French family who had settled in New England, much earlier, and that family had become very successful in business. And then Melville's mother descended from an old New York Dutch family, very much the type that Irving was writing about back in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So that's kind of fun. That kind of gives us a connection to some stuff that we've already looked at. So Melville's early life was sort of spent in luxury, but then the family hit hard times. I guess his father was not as good of a businessman as previous Melvilles had been, because ultimately his dad blows the family fortune and I believe commits suicide, or he dies one way or another when Melville is like 12 years old. So Melville is then pulled out of school, and he's actually forced to go to work to help support the family. And as a result, he's not able to pursue higher education. He never goes to college like Hawthorne and Poe did. Instead, when he's 21 years old, after a few years of working odd jobs, he becomes a sailor. He signs on as a sailor aboard a whaling vessel bound for the South Pacific. So this is an important event in Melville's life. He only spends about a year or maybe two as a sailor, and then he kind of jumps ship, literally, abandons his ship and makes it back to the U.S. later. But, he's able to draw a lot of material from his experiences as a sailor. If you're familiar with Moby Dick, even if you haven't read it, you're probably somewhat familiar with the story. It's obviously set aboard a whaling vessel, and Melville's able to use his own experiences to write a lot of his future fiction. In fact, when he first embarks on his writing career in the 1840s, he's very much using his nautical experience to benefit him. So his first two novels were pretty successful. The first one came out in 1846. It was called Typee. And then 1 year later, in 1847, he released a similar type novel called Amu. So these were considered nautical adventure novels. They were both set in the South Pacific, like Tahiti and islands like that. And again, he had visited some of those places himself. So he's drawing a little bit on personal experience, the experience of other sailors that he had known and talked to. And these are adventure stories. They're accessible, they're pretty fun, and they were pretty popular when they came out. They have a pretty high level of readability, the suspense and action that you would expect to find in adventure stories. But they were somewhat innovative. The adventure genre already existed. And again, we've already experienced a little bit of it with frontier romance. They're very much tapping into adventure, action. So we had adventure novels, we had frontier romances, but Melville is among the first authors to really take that genre and take it to sea, take it to the high seas, make it into a nautical adventure. So those novels sold pretty well. They were also critical successes, and it looked like Melville was off to a promising start as a fiction writer. But he wanted to write different kinds of novels. He didn't want to write popular adventure novels for his entire career. So using some of the money and some of the recognition that those early novels earned him, he set to work on what would eventually become Moby Dick. He wanted to write novels that were darker, more complex than the sort of simplistic adventure narratives that he started with. He was very interested in metaphysics and other branches of philosophy, religion, psychology, history, other works of literature. He wanted to explore a lot of these disciplines. He wanted to explore really some dark aspects of human psychology, things that remained mysterious to the human mind. So he had these kinds of ambitions, and he didn't feel like those early novels were really a great showcase for all of the different things that he wanted to do and write about. So in 1851, Moby Dick comes out, and it was not a popular or critical success, because Melville was no longer operating in a recognizable, familiar genre or style. If you've ever read Moby Dick, or if you've ever heard anything about it, you probably know that it contains a whole bunch of different things. I mean, on its surface, it is a pretty straightforward adventure story about a whaling vessel sort of doing battle with a very large, angry, and dangerous whale. But there's a lot more in it than just that basic narrative. There are all kinds of sub-narratives, like narratives within narratives, but also Melville incorporates a lot of stuff that isn't even strictly the domain of fiction. Like, he brings in a lot of information about whales, about the whaling industry as it existed, back in New England in the 19th century. He brings in a lot of stuff from the Bible, from Shakespeare, science, history, philosophy. You need footnotes to read Moby Dick. You need, maybe some dictionaries, some encyclopedias. I had to consult a copy of the Bible because he makes so many references to biblical passages. It helps to know your Shakespeare because he definitely quotes a lot of Shakespearean plays. He's referencing characters and themes from a lot of different literary works. So it's dense, it's packed full of stuff, it's ambiguous, and people didn't really like it when it first came out. It did not suit the literary tastes of the 1850s. But what's interesting to note about the novel is that it very much suits more modern tastes. And this is why we often say that Melville was ahead of his time. He was innovative in ways that did not really get him a lot of success in the mid-19th century, but now we can appreciate those innovations and we can see that he was really anticipating a lot of future developments in American literature. So a few things that we like about Melville, or at least scholars and critics like about Melville, are the very things that people rejected him for back in the 1850s. So that literariness that I was referring to, using all of these allusions to Shakespeare and other older literary texts. He does that, and we can appreciate that. Also, there's sort of a meta quality to a lot of Melville, and certainly Moby Dick is no exception. You guys are probably familiar with the notion of metafiction, which in its strict technical definition just means fiction that is about fiction, or fiction that is about the making of fiction. But in a more general sense, the way we typically use the term today is just to refer to art that is sort of self-conscious, art that knows it's art. Art that is somewhat aware of its own artificiality, its own constructedness. And sometimes it will comment on, the conventions or the standards that govern it as a work of art. And sometimes it might sort of make fun of those conventions, or it might sort of comment on them or subvert them in some way, sort of find a way to upset reader expectations, because again, it knows the genre that it's in, it knows what the readers or viewers expect, and sometimes the work of art and the artist is having fun with those conventions. So again, it's just, in the case of fiction, it's just a novel or a short story that's very aware that it's a novel and a short story, and it's very aware of the larger tradition or the larger genre that it belongs to. So again, this is typical of a lot of modern art, certainly a lot of modern fiction, and it's often associated with what we consider postmodern, or the sort of postmodern era, or the postmodern style of art. Again, that's not exclusive to literature, but it does include literature. So we're not going to talk about postmodernism in here. You guys will learn about it in Dr. Cooley's class in 451B, and I'm not really qualified to teach you about it, but as you'll learn in Nick's class, postmodernism in American Lit really takes off after World War II. And some people might argue that we're still in the postmodern period. Other people might say we're in the postmodern period. I don't really know. But we tend to like postmodern art, or we at least appreciate it, and it's very familiar to us today. But back in the 1850s, metafiction, being meta, that wasn't really a thing, or at least it wasn't as celebrated, and it was not as common. So it works well now. It didn't work as well back then. And again, Melville is very playful. You guys might be able to pick up on that, particularly in the incantatas. He likes puzzles, he likes riddles, he likes to sort of deceive his audience a little bit, and many scholars notice a similarity between Hawthorne and Melville in that regard. And those guys were actually friends. They were friends, they knew each other, they read each other's work, they corresponded with one another. I think they're quite different stylistically, but they did have some of the same preoccupations. The dark side of human psychology, sort of plumbing the depths of American history. They were doing a lot of the same stuff, and they both liked riddles. They both liked to sort of give the readers a surface level perception of things, and then sort of invite the reader to maybe dig a little bit deeper and find the real truth beneath the surface. We kind of saw that when we read Hawthorne, particularly in My Kinsman Major Molyneux. So Melville is invested in some of that same stuff. All of the allusions to other works, the meta quality that we've talked about, and also the ambiguity. Not always resolving things to the satisfaction of his audience, not having a lot of clear-cut moral lessons. Let's not forget that throughout the 19th century, even as we modernized and the world is changing rapidly, a lot of American readers held on to this idea that's really passed down from older times, that literature needs to have a moral. Literature needs to provide some form of moral instruction. Remember, that's what the Puritans thought. That's what writers were still claiming to do in the 1790s, even up until the early 19th century. We kind of see Sedgwick make this move in Hope Leslie. Oh, this is a fun adventure story, but it will also help teach school children about American history, and will have a better, more equitable understanding of American history. That's kind of the idea. Remember, she was invested also in trying to sort of advocate for the humanity of Native Americans. So she's trying to accomplish these moral goals through the fiction, through the literature. And as we've talked about with sentimental writers, they were kind of doing a similar thing, right? Sentimental fiction was supposed to promote moral rectitude and right feeling by having these heightened emotions, by feeling sympathy, by feeling bad for characters, by wanting to help the less fortunate. We're going to become better people. Not just readers, we're going to become better people in our everyday lives. So that was always implicit in a lot of the fiction throughout the 19th century, and in some cases it was explicit. It was clearly stated as part of the goal, part of the overall message. So when somebody like Melville or Hawthorne comes around with their moral ambiguity and their sort of refusal to abide by any kind of binary, white and black, good and bad, right and wrong, they're blurring the lines, they're having a lot of fun in those gray areas. And that was not always a recipe for success during their time period. But now, in contemporary fiction, we tend to accept moral ambiguity. We don't necessarily reject it. I think a lot of people view it as more honest in some ways than always having the right answer, always having a happy ending, always having the good guy triumph, because as we know, life's not really like that. So perhaps Melville and Hawthorne are capturing something that we recognize as modern readers as maybe a little bit more authentic in some ways, more challenging, maybe a little bit more depressing, but in part because of those things, it might also be a little bit more true to life, to our own lived experiences. But anyway, once Moby Dick came out, Melville's career never really recovered. He never really became a popular, successful writer again. But he kept writing. And nowadays, a lot of the stuff that we read and a lot of the stuff that we celebrate by him was written sort of well after that first brush with fame, when he had become largely forgotten by the reading public. He kept publishing, some novels and some short fiction. Some people read them, some people reviewed them and thought they were pretty good, but none of them were big successes on either the popular or critical level. So he wrote some other novels like Marty and Pierre, and he also really turned to short fiction, what we might call periodical fiction. Throughout the 1850s, he increasingly started to write more short stories. And he published a lot of these serially in literary magazines or periodicals, like we've mentioned before. So both Benito Cereno and the Encantadas were originally published in a literary sort of magazine called Putnam's Monthly Magazine of American Literature, Science, and Art. He also published some short fiction in Harper's Magazine, a very prominent literary periodical, which I believe still exists today. Putnam's does not, but I think Harper's still does. So he became a very skilled practitioner of short fiction. So today we like a lot of his short stories. Again, Benito Cereno, much like Bartleby, kind of straddles the line between being a very long short story and maybe being a novella or a short novel. It's probably a little bit beyond a short story, but it's not quite a novel. So sometimes we use the term novella to refer to something in between a short story and a novel. Sometimes we'll use the term short novel. Sometimes a novella is thought to be distinct from a short novel. Sometimes they're considered to be essentially the same thing. There aren't a lot of hard and fast rules about novellas in short novels. They're a little bit nebulous and hard to define, which seems appropriate. That seems like an appropriate register for Melville to be operating in. So in these shorter works, sometimes he was aiming for a little bit more popular success. We can see that particularly with the Encantadas, because in a lot of ways it resembled popular travel literature of the period. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So he was trying to tone down some of his more obscure interests that seemed to turn people off. He was pursuing some degree of popular success, but that large-scale success continued to pretty much elude him. So by the 1860s, really, we would consider his professional writing career to be over. He was no longer earning money from his writing by the 1860s. So he got a real job. He had to just sort of give up the ghost. He actually obtained a position as a customs inspector at the New York City Customs House right after the Civil War ended, around, I believe, 1866. And he held that job for about 25 years, I think, until he died. He died in the early 1890s. He lived a long life. But again, towards the end of his life, he was very much living in obscurity. People did not really remember him. People had forgotten Typee and Amu, those early nautical adventures. And he was just sort of living a normal workaday, everyday life. But even before he died, in the 1880s, he began to experience a little bit of a revival. But the catch was that the revival was not happening here in America. It was happening in England. So this was a similar process with Poe, a little bit with Hawthorne. Like, these guys got popular in places like England and France. In some cases, they were even more popular over there than they were here. This was a little bit true of Irving, too, our first literary celebrity, our first literary export, as we talked about weeks ago. And it was only after the English or the French sort of discovered or rediscovered these authors and wrote about them and celebrated them, then that sort of movement, immigrated over to the States, and we sort of joined in. So that very much happened with Melville. I actually have this quote from an English writer. I don't have the name anymore, but this is from a sort of a newspaper article written in an English newspaper in the 1880s. The article is about Whitman. It's not about Melville. It's about Whitman. But this English writer had traveled to New York in pursuit of Whitman. So he's like traveling around New York and he's writing about his experiences. But in this particular passage, he's writing about Melville. While he's in New York, he decides to look up Melville as well, because English readers were kind of getting into Melville and they wanted to know more about him. So here's what this English guy has to say. I saw everywhere for this Titan who is still living somewhere in New York. No one seemed to know anything of the one great imaginative writer fit to stand shoulder to shoulder with Whitman on that continent. So the thesis of this particular English journalist is that Whitman is like the premier American writer. Whitman's number one. But the only other guy that can really hold a candle to him is Melville. So this Englishman is sort of shocked and horrified to find that nobody cares about Melville in his own hometown of New York City. Nobody's talking about him. Nobody even really knows where he lives. Forget being a celebrity, he's not really known at all. And to this English journalist, that's a great injustice, because Melville was a great artist like Whitman. So he deserves to be celebrated and sort of remembered. So the American revival would not really start until the 1920s. And at that point, more and more American scholars, American critics are starting to write about him. And then by the 1940s, with Matheson and that important group of scholars who created the American literary canon as we've usually known it. They, of course, include Melville. By that point, it was pretty clear, at least in the world of American literary study, that Melville was a titan. He was one of the big heavy hitters of the American Renaissance, along with his friend Hawthorne and, Whitman. They agreed with that English journalist to a large extent. So, ever since, he's been considered one of our greatest writers, and some will even argue that Moby Dick is the closest thing we've ever had to a great American novel. You don't have to agree with that. I think we've had a lot of great American novels, but it is certainly one of them. So let's talk about some of his characteristics, some of the ways we can describe him as a writer. Because again, depending on your own inclinations, your own tastes, you might find Melville to be a real joy to read, or you might find him to be a real chore. So he is dense. His texts are dense. That means they are packed full of a lot of things, not only references to other things, science, history, philosophy, literature, but also just his sentence structure. He packs a lot of stuff into individual sentences. There would be clause upon clause, idea upon idea. It can sometimes get a little confusing. It can get a little bewildering. And he does sometimes require a second or even a third reading because you will miss stuff on the initial read. So he's dense, he's ambiguous, I've already mentioned that. He doesn't always give us easy answers, and he's not always giving us moral clarity. And that sort of upset people back in the 1850s. He is complex, he is difficult, but he's also been described as extremely perceptive. He's been described as a master storyteller, endlessly inventive. I do think he was those things. Forward thinking. Again, sort of in some ways very modern for his time period in terms of his style, what he was doing, and a lot of his fiction. But he's also very interested in what we might call liminal spaces or intermediate spaces. The spaces in between. These gray areas. Literally, we refer to these things as gray areas. And you're going to notice that gray is kind of a motif in Benito Cereno. It comes up a lot. He repeats it a lot. He describes a lot of things as being gray. And we're also exploring gray space, gray areas in the text between right and wrong, good and bad, righteous and evil. He's very interested in perception and the nature of perception. And again, we're going to see that in Benito Cereno. A lot of the perceptions that we first get are proven later to be inaccurate. So again, we have this surface level that we're invited to believe, at least at first, and then we have to get beneath it. We have to dig deeper to try to apprehend the truth. So a lot of his text will contain humor. I'm going to try to point out a little bit of it. It's often lost on modern readers, and it can often get lost in his very wordy sentences. But he can be funny. He is playful, but he also incorporates a lot of tragedy. Again, that's kind of the influence of Shakespeare and maybe the Bible. He was very well versed in religion. He's very interested in despair, but also hopefulness and the sort of contrast and the push and pull between the two. Also, mystery versus illumination. He and Hawthorne both really like the idea of certain things being shrouded in literal and figurative darkness, and then at times they will be illuminated. They will be revealed for what they truly are. So we can see evidence of a lot of that stuff in what we're reading this week. So he did enjoy sort of confounding readers, but there was a larger purpose. So I have a quote from him. And he has a lot of sort of cryptic quotations, but he is at one point telling somebody that, we live in a world of lies, and the truth can only be told covertly and in small increments. So that's kind of how he's operating. So he has this literary theory kind of his own, and he claims that a true writer is really writing for two different audiences. So here's a quote from him. One of the audiences is composed of the mob. And he describes the mob as sort of the typical reader. And the other group that the true writer, is writing for, the other group is composed of, quote, eagle-eyed readers who perceive the true meaning of those passages that the author has directly calculated to deceive, to egregiously deceive the superficial skimmer of pages. So he claims that the vast majority of readers are not very good readers. They're superficial readers. They're just paying attention to the surface, to those surface level appearances. And they're not digging deep. They're not actually apprehending the truth. So he's saying that he intentionally writes certain passages that are meant to deceive those kinds of superficial readers. But the true eagle-eyed reader can perceive the true meaning of those passages that deceive less close readers, right? So, of course, we want to be eagle-eyed readers when we are reading Melville. And you might not really care for the way that he's phrasing that. You might feel like that's a little bit pretentious or a little bit elitist, that he's, intentionally deceiving a lot of readers and he only feels like a small group can really get at the truth. But whether we like it or not, we have to acknowledge that that is kind of the way to approach Melville. There's the surface, and then there's what he's intending for the eagle-eyed readers beneath the surface. So if we're really going to understand his text, if we're going to understand his artistry, we have to dig beneath that surface. So let's do that with Benito Cereno. On the most basic level, this is a story of an American sea captain's adventures on board a Spanish slave ship. And as we eventually learn, I hope I'm not giving anything away, the ship has been taken over by the slaves. So this is the story of a slave insurrection. But that's not immediately clear to the readers, because it's also not immediately clear to Captain Delano. He's not our narrator. Notice that we have a third-person narrator who's actually telling the story. And that's typically what Melville does. He'll have sort of a detached third-person narrator telling the story, providing commentary at times on certain characters. So even though Delano does not tell the story, we get a lot of our perceptions, we get a lot of our understanding through him. So in many ways, he is our lens. He's sort of our entry point into what's happening on board this ship. And don't be, and just make sure to keep in mind, this is a slave ship, right? This is a ship transporting slaves from Africa to the New World, presumably South America. I think they're off the coast of Chile. So they're either going to South America or maybe the Caribbean. But this is a slave ship that has been taken over by the slaves. So by writing about this, Melville is tapping into a thread of American popular culture and American history that would have been very resonant, would have been very powerful at the time. It's kind of easy for us to maybe miss it or to miss its importance, but slave insurrections and the threat of slave insurrections were a big part of American life throughout the first half of the 19th century. As we know, in the decades leading up to the Civil War, more and more states are abolishing slavery, but of course it remains in the South up until the Civil War. But going all the way back to our colonial history, there's a long lineage of slave uprisings and rebellions. There are some famous ones that perhaps you've heard of. Denmark Vesey in the 1700s in South Carolina led a pretty famous attempted rebellion. Obviously, most of these were put down pretty quickly. In the case of Vesey, who was right outside of Charleston, he was apprehended and his whole plan was really thwarted pretty early on before it could really get underway. But another one that took place later, I want to say maybe in the 1820s or 1830s in Virginia, involved Nat Turner. And that's a name that we kind of remember because he led one of the more bloody and one of the more nearly successful slave rebellions in Southern Virginia. He and his followers actually murdered several local white residents in their attempts to, force their way into freedom. They were eventually found, apprehended, and executed. But there's been a lot of fiction written about Turner. Beginning when he was still in jail, a local newspaper man came and apparently, according to the writer, interviewed Turner and then wrote basically a biography of Turner based on those interviews. A lot of that was fabricated, but future writers would also use that subject matter. So he's a figure that's lived on. There's been books, there's been movies about Nat Turner's rebellion. He continues to be remembered, but there were many others. Gabriel Prosser, the Stono Rebellion, which was also in South Carolina. So again, there's a long history of slave insurrections. And in slave-holding states, it was always viewed as a threat, as a potential danger. Because in places like South Carolina and Virginia, in many parts of those states, slaves outnumbered white people. So it was pretty well known that if the slaves had enough manpower, if they could ever get their hands on enough weapons, they had the numerical superiority. They had a certain numerical advantage over a lot of these planters, these plantation owners, and other white residents of these areas. So this was a constant fear in slaveholding states. Now, in places in New England that had already abolished slavery, Delano's from Massachusetts, right? So in his home, there is no more slavery, but it's still something that was on the minds of Americans. They might have read about slave rebellions. They might still have been a little bit vaguely nervous about what would happen if slaves were able to rise up and take power, because there was a precedent for that, not in America, but in Haiti, in the Caribbean, part of the larger Americas, not far from the U.S. You guys probably know that in the very early 1800s, the island of Haiti, well, it shares, it's part of the island of what we call Hispaniola, where Columbus, I think, first landed. Half of it's Haiti, half of it is now the Dominican Republic. But you guys probably know that in the early 1800s, the slaves of Haiti, that had been a French colony, they rose up and rebelled against their French masters, ultimately fought a war against the French, and they won. The French were pushed out, most white residents of the island left, and the former slaves became free. They took power, and that became a republic, really the first black republic of the New World. And that scared the hell out of slave owners, as you can probably imagine. That scared a lot of people in America, in South America, in the U.S., in South America, Central America, because if it could happen there, it could conceivably happen elsewhere. So Melville's tapping into all of that history, all of those sort of apprehensions about a slave insurrection. And a lot of fiction was sort of interested in this theme. So he's playing with that a little bit. But there's a lot more going on here. This is not a straightforward adventure story. It really is sort of like a riddle. It unfolds slowly. And again, it's also a commentary on perception, the nature of perception, and how people can be led astray. How a lot of their perceptions can end up being false or built upon false assumptions. So we're going to see that with Delano. So obviously, this work of fiction is about slavery. It's about racism, kind of writ large. Those are big central concerns. But true to form, Melville's narrative style here is very ambiguous. At times, it's a little bit indirect, and it's very layered. So easy interpretations and solid answers are pretty hard to come by. And we can have a wide range of opinions about this. If you remember that quote I read you guys last week when we were talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, this quote from Jane Tompkins, a very important American literary scholar from many decades ago who did some great work with sentimental novels. She makes the argument when writing about Stowe, but really she's writing about sentimental novelists in general. She makes the argument that even though they were dismissed back then because of the heightened emotions and the melodrama, she says really it's writers like Stowe who actually made an impact with their fiction. They actually made a political impact because they were providing this really clear and emotionally powerful social criticism that anybody could see. And she directly contrasts them with Hawthorne and Melville. And she says Hawthorne and Melville really weren't as successful in getting their messages out because they were so damn ambiguous, because it's hard to know what they necessarily mean at certain times. So yes, there's great artistry, there's a lot of riddles, we can appreciate that, but Tompkins might be right that the nature of this narrative makes it kind of hard to tell what exactly Melville thinks, or what exactly Melville wants us to think, right? Clearly, he is commenting on racism, and I don't necessarily think he's championing slavery. In fact, there is a lot of criticism of both slavery and the sort of racist ideas that often pop up in characters like Delano. But Delano is a difficult guy to get a read on because he's not a mean-spirited or cruel person. Most readers find him to be pretty likable. He's helpful. He's sort of generous and intrepid. He has, in many ways, what would often be described, at least back then, as sort of a prototypical American spirit, right? He's brave, he's hale and hearty, and he's not thinking too hard about a lot of things. He's a man of action. He's a sea captain, right? So he has all these physical virtues. He's brave and he's honest and he wants to help others. But Melville does poke fun at him at times for maybe not always being the sharpest pencil in the box. So there is that. But again, we can often get sort of lost in the different layers of complexity here. A lot of people, when they read this, feel like the narrator might also be biased against African Americans and might have certain racist ideas, and that's very possible. But there's also the possibility that the narrator is trying to capture the views of people like Delano. And Delano, despite his many virtues, is in fact a racist, as most American white people, unfortunately, would have been in the 1850s. It's kind of an uncomfortable truth that we often don't want to confront, but even abolitionists during this period, even people who were virulently opposed to slavery, often still subscribe to the idea that black people were intellectually inferior to white people. There was a lot of pseudoscience sort of circulating throughout not only the U.S., but really, Western Europe, the entire Americas. And these were all, of course, wrong. These were, filled with errors, filled with false assumptions. But a lot of people believed that. Even people who thought slavery was wrong often would not have acknowledged that blacks and whites were equal. So that kind of gets laid bare here in this text, and it's uncomfortable, right? Because we often want to like Delano. We want to root for Delano. He doesn't seem like a bad guy. And his brand of racism is not the super violent kind. It's not the most obvious kind. It's the more subtle kind that Melville seems to want to explore. And it's the kind of racism that a lot of people in America would have had. Not necessarily the slave owners, but people like Delano who are in states that had already gotten rid of slavery. People who probably were anti-slavery and would have certainly been on, the side of the Union in the upcoming Civil War, but they still had a lot of racist assumptions. They still subscribed to a lot of inaccurate stereotypes. And in the case of Delano, subscribing to those false ways of thinking creates false perceptions for him. Those false ways of thinking cause him to misunderstand what's happening on board the ship. Okay, so we can notice that. We should observe that over the course of the narrative. So again, there's a lot of different views, a lot of different critical positions and opinions about this particular text. Again, some will argue that Melville's own views towards slavery and abolition are too ambiguous to really be successful. They're too hard to pin down. Others will claim that this is a very obvious indictment of slavery, a very obvious piece of social criticism, just shrouded in Melville's typical mystery and ambiguity. Again, in terms of how we interpret certain characters, again, Delano is sometimes thought of as a good guy, likable, but others see him as maybe emblematic of bigger problems. And the same with Babbo, who we later learn is the leader of the slave insurrection. Some readers and critics, particularly from earlier decades, as you can imagine, back in the segregation days of the earlier 20th century, a lot of readers responded to Babbo very unfavorably. A lot of white readers, of course. They viewed him as sort of evil, as this sort of conniving, scheming, manipulative, evil creature that one should fear. But now, in our modern day, a lot of readers look at Babbo as something much more complex and much more important. Yes, he might be manipulative in a certain way, and yes, he does threaten violence in certain ways, but he's also very disciplined. He's very capable, and he's capable of a wide range of actions and behaviors. So what a lot of critics have pointed out is this is kind of Melville's way of arguing for equality, right? We would expect a high level of complexity with a lot of white characters. We would expect a white character to have some good qualities, but also some bad qualities, especially if this is a realistic novel that's trying to capture people as they really are. Most people are a combination of good and bad. But oftentimes, and we even see this with, I think, Sedgwick and certainly with James Fenimore Cooper, we see this when writers are depicting Native American characters or African American characters, basically any non-white character. They'll often reduce them, I'm talking about 19th century writers, they'll often reduce those non-white characters to stereotypes. They'll reduce them to one quality or a handful of qualities. They deny those non-white characters complexity. And in the process, they're sort of denying their humanity. Because to be human is to be complex. Okay? So even with Sedgwick, when she's trying to paint a favorable picture of Native American characters, she's still reducing those characters to a handful of traits, right? Noble, virtuous, brave, honest, just a handful of things. She's not allowing those characters to be very complex. And again, we see that in a lot of frontier romance. There's good Indians and there's bad Indians. And there's not much in between. The bad ones need to be killed. The good ones can maybe assimilate and hang out with white people. And that's often what we get, even in sympathetic portrayals of non-white characters. Lord knows you can see it in Stowe, if you ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Again, a really important novel. Did a lot of important cultural, social, political work. But she's not really allowing her black characters to have a lot of interiority, to have a lot of complexity. She reduces them to stereotypes. And in some ways, that might have been unavoidable for a lot of writers during that time period because, frankly, a lot of white readers would not have come into contact with African Americans very often, at least not in ways that would have allowed them to learn more about African Americans. And we kind of see that again with Delano. We can actually, I have a quote here from a critic about that. We can get to it in a moment. But there's this idea that, even with a character who thinks that he's open-minded, thinks that he likes black people, he still misunderstands them. He reduces them to simple stereotypes instead of seeing them as fully and truly human. And that leads to problems of perception, as we're going to see. So I just wanted to read a little bit from the opening of the story, just so we can kind of hear the lyricism of Melville's writing, notice a few things that he likes to do. Also, I want us to notice the repetition of gray, the importance of gray, both as a color and as a space. That sort of in-between space that I mentioned before. So this is very early on, like the third paragraph of the story. The morning was one peculiar to that coast. Everything was mute and calm, everything gray. The sea, though undulated into long roods of swells, seemed fixed and was sleeked at the surface like waved lead that has cooled and set in the smelter's mold. The sky seemed a gray surtout. A surtout is like an old-timey term for like a man's overcoat. The sky seemed a gray surtout. Flights of troubled gray fowl, kith and kin with flights of troubled gray vapors among which they were mixed, skimmed low and fitfully over the waters, as swallows over meadows before storms. Shadows present, foreshadowing deeper shadows to come. So that's just a really wonderful passage. You notice some of that repetition. You notice, again, a little bit of that density in his descriptions by sort of piling on multiple similes, multiple phrases, multiple clauses, but kind of telling us that everything here is gray. And he's being pretty explicit by Melville standards, telling us that all of this grayness is working to foreshadow things. Right? The shadows. And we saw shadows with Hawthorne as well. Literally and figuratively obscuring the truth. Okay, so we have grayness again, we have shadows again, and they are foreshadowing deeper shadows to come. So you notice certain verbal repetition, but he really wants us to get a sense of the setting, but also he wants to make clear the connection between the physical setting and the sort of mental space that we are going to be occupying here. The philosophical space. Metaphysics was a real preoccupation for him. So that's just a great passage, and it gives us a lot to work with as we move ahead in the narrative. But then in the very next paragraph, he begins to describe Delano. And I just want us to read a little bit of this. I'm actually going to pick things up mid-sentence. So this is the very next paragraph after the one that I was reading. Captain Delano's surprise might have deepened into some uneasiness had he not been a person of a singularly undistrustful good nature, not liable except on extraordinary and repeated incentives, and hardly then, to indulge in personal alarms, any way involving the imputation of malign evil in man. Whether, in view of what humanity is capable, such a trait implies, along with a benevolent heart, more than ordinary quickness and accuracy of intellectual perception, may be left to the wise to determine. So this is a move that Melville makes a lot. He'll raise this question, and then in the guise of his narrator, he'll say, oh, well, I can't answer that question. I'll leave that question to the readers or to the wise to answer. But notice what he's saying here about Delano. He's saying that, okay, he's a very trusting guy, right? Even with ample evidence, he's still reluctant to assume the worst in people. He's not going to, assume that anybody has malign or evil intentions. So that seems like a good thing. That's part of his sort of wholesome, all-American persona, right? He's just a good, sort of good-natured guy, and he likes to think the best of people. That's usually considered a good trait to have in a human. But then, as he often does, Melville complicates that. He says, whether in view of what humanity is capable of, that's actually, well, I mean, okay, I'll back up. Because again, it's a really dense thought to unpack. But he's saying, okay, so he's trusting. Okay, great. But if we keep in mind what humanity is capable of, we have to ask ourselves, does being so trusting signal any real intellectual gifts? Like, does it signal any perception, any quickness in perception, in addition to the benevolent heart that it obviously does indicate? But we have to ask ourselves, does being a trusting person make you smart? Just to really simplify, does being trusting equal intelligence and perception? And he doesn't answer that question. He says he'll leave it to the wise to answer, but just through the fact that he's posing the question and he's doing it in kind of a playful way, we should at least be thinking about it, and we might decide that just by posing the question, he is kind of providing an answer. He's saying maybe Delano's not the smartest guy. He's nice and helpful. He's a good ship captain. He gets things done. He's very capable. But that trusting nature, while it makes him a very agreeable guy, it makes people like him, it doesn't make him very perceptive. And again, that's important to keep in mind because we're going to see that play out over the course of the narrative. So again, a lot of what we see on board the San Dominic, that's the name of the ship, a lot of what we see is presented through the eyes of Delano, even though he's not technically our narrator. So remember, that means that we are often seeing the Africans on board the ship as he sees them, not as they really are. So Delano's big problem is he assumes that Africans are only capable of doing certain things. They are good valets. They are good hairdressers. At one point in the narrative, he says that there's something, again, Delano is thinking this to himself, that, Africans just have a real skill about sort of, being an attendant. They're really good attendants. In fact, we can turn to that passage now if I can find it. But this is another one of those gray areas, because where do the narrator's observations end and Delano's begin? Can we notice a difference? All right, because the paragraph I was just mentioning, and my pagination's different than y'all's. I'm sorry, I'm using a different edition. So this is about 40 pages into the story. And there's a paragraph that I was just paraphrasing where the narrator says there is something in the Negro which in a peculiar way fits him for avocations about one's person. Then he goes on to say that they are natural valets and hairdressers. So that's offensive, I think, to most modern readers. Again, reducing an entire group of people to a couple of occupations. And then later he says that Negroes are very good at dancing and playing musical instruments. So that's the narrator talking. So when we hear that, we can say, all right, well, the narrator possesses racist views, and the narrator might be speaking for Melville. So perhaps Melville also possesses racist views. And that's very possible. But it's also possible that the narrator is trying to get us closer to Delano. And the narrator is trying to capture the predominant way of thinking that would have existed for Delano and other white people during this time. Because in the very next paragraph, if you can keep following along, the very next paragraph after the one I was just in, we shift to Delano. And the narrator is again describing Delano, but he's giving us access to some of Delano's thoughts and some of Delano's own personal attitudes. So about halfway down the next paragraph, when at ease with respect to exterior things, Captain Delano's nature in regards to African Americans was not only benign, but familiarly and humorously so. At home, back in Massachusetts, he had often taken rare satisfaction in sitting at his door, watching some free man of color at his work or play. If on a voyage he chanced to have a black sailor, invariably he was on chatty and half gamesome terms with him. In fact, like most men of a good, blithe heart, Captain Delano took to Negroes. Not philanthropically, but genially, just as other men to Newfoundland dogs. So that's a really important passage. And again, if you're just paying attention to the surface level, you might think, once again, that this is a pretty favorable description of Delano. Basically, the narrator is saying Delano likes black people. He's on good terms with them. When he has a black sailor in his crew, he's usually cracking jokes and kind of having a playful, very agreeable relationship with that sailor. So that all sounds pretty good, but then if we dig a little bit deeper, we notice there's some real problems here with what Delano thinks and how he feels. Again, notice what's getting described, what Delano's thinking about, right? Back at home, he had often taken rare satisfaction in sitting in his door watching some free man of color, because of course African Americans in Massachusetts would have been free at this time, watching, but not equal, let's be clear about that, free but very much not equal. So he enjoyed watching them play or work. So they're kind of entertainment for him, right? And again, he's on humorous, joking terms, chatty, half gamesome. So cracking jokes, making small talk. That's how he interacts with African Americans. He finds them entertaining. He finds them humorous also. And then, of course, that final sort of pounding message that we get at the end, he took to Negroes, not philanthropically. To be philanthropic means that you're sort of, helping, you're helping advance the race. You're helping their betterment. You're donating money or time to help them. So notice it's made very clear he's not doing that. He's not philanthropically inclined towards Negroes, but he is genial towards them. He jokes around with them. He likes them. They make him laugh. So he takes to them much like other men take to dogs. So notice that comparison, and that is not meant to be a favorable comparison for our ship captain, okay, for Delano. That's not favorable. He looks at black people much like other men would look at dogs. They're fun, they're entertaining, you like them, but that's about the extent of it. You're not going to help them. You're not really invested in their betterment. You're not all that concerned about their well-being. You're just on kind of playful, joking terms with them. So again, on the surface, that might not seem like a damning indictment, but if we dig a little bit deeper, I think it is, at least to our modern perceptions. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement for our protagonist here, for Delano. But again, like I said, just be aware. I'm not going to get into all the details of this. I might include a little bit of it in the overview in the module, but just be aware that throughout the 19th century, there were all these pseudo-scientific theories about the origins of the races and the differences between the races. Again, all of that stuff has been debunked, pretty much. All of that stuff was wrong. But a lot of it was, of course, used as justification for slavery, or at least for the unequal society that we had at the time. Oh, well, blacks shouldn't have the same rights because, of this and this and this. These were kind of, after the fact justifications that were used throughout slaveholding societies. And the U.S. still was one of those societies, even in the 1850s. So again, that was just those kinds of ideas were circulating. And really, there was a lot of, disagreement about what that all meant. Some white people said because blacks were intellectually inferior, they didn't deserve freedom. They were natural slaves. That was still a theory that was propagated. But a more sort of generous reading that some abolitionists even had was, sure, they're intellectually inferior, but they still deserve freedom. They still deserve rights. And then there were some who would argue that if given a chance to flourish, if given access to education, they could, attain the same level as white people. So there was a wide range of different positions, different feelings, but there were a lot of racist assumptions and stereotypes that were just accepted back then, that were accepted in some cases as science, or at least accepted as true for a lot of Americans. So Delano is one of those Americans. He's not a virulent, violent racist, but he still subscribes to a lot of racist and narrow-minded stereotypes. He clearly believes that Africans are inherently inferior in many different ways. And that belief makes him unable to understand what's actually happened on board the San Dominic, because he doesn't think Africans are capable of taking over the ship. He doesn't think Africans are capable of steering the ship and continuing on the journey. Of course, they're on a detour now, but he doesn't think Africans are capable of that level of organization, that level of discipline, that level of knowledge. So again, his stereotypes are directly responsible, the stereotypes he believes in are directly responsible for his misapprehensions, his inability to perceive accurately. So just keep that in mind. And also, keep in mind that Melville is basing all of this on a true story and a real person. So Delano is a real person, and he wrote a text, I believe in 1817, called The Narrative of Voyages and Travels in the Northern and Southern Hemispheres. Quite a mouthful. Delano really was a ship captain from New England, and he wrote these sort of travel narratives about his voyages that took place like in the 1790s and the first decade of the 1800s. And one of those voyages included an episode that he titled The Capture of the Spanish Ship Trial at Santa Maria Island, Chile. And that's the basis for Melville's work of fiction. So, of course, Melville's changing some details. He's altering a few things to suit his purposes, but the basic structure of the narrative is largely lifted from Delano's own account. And again, he comes across a Spanish slaving ship in which the slaves had taken over. But in the real life, Delano spends virtually no time describing or discussing the slaves. He's not interested in the slaves. He doesn't talk about the slaves. And we should also, I'm probably using that term too broadly. They're not slaves yet, right? They've been taken prisoner, right? They've been captured forcibly, but from their homes, but they have not been enshrined in New World slavery yet. But that's, of course, their fate. So notice the difference, right? Melville, on the other hand, is very, very interested in the slaves, what they've done, the African characters, what they've done, their sort of techniques, their strategies, particularly through the character of Babbo. So we can see all of that. And again, here's that quote from the critic that I mentioned before about Delano's just lack of understanding in general, his inability to accurately understand African Americans. So this critic from, I don't remember who said this, but here's the quote. Delano probably had no contact with secretly intelligent and willful black men. Because again, black people had to conceal those things. Black people had to appear docile, obedient, loyal if they didn't want to be harassed, beaten, killed in many corners of America. So they had to keep a lot of their personalities, a lot of their capabilities secret, submerged, hidden beneath the surface, which appeals to Melville. The thought, back to the quote, the thought that black people, like white people, could have both the capability and the desire to force their own will on others is totally outside of Delano's experience and hence outside of his knowledge. So in other words, it never really occurs to Delano that Africans can do the same stuff as white people. Africans could take violent action, they could take control of the ship, but more importantly, they could organize. they could devise a strategy that was not only successful in their initial rebellion, but they're even successful in concealing the truth from Delano. Because, of course, when Delano and his ship show up, the Africans understand we have to keep this secret, right? If Delano finds out what's going on, it's all over for us. So not only does their initial rebellion work, they're also pretty skilled at maintaining the secret. And it's Delano who doesn't understand. It's Delano who seems to be perhaps a little bit intellectually inferior in some ways. And again, the problem for him is that he's a black and white thinker. He can't read between the lines. He's not comfortable in that middle ground, that gray area, the intermediate area between those clear binaries. So he gets lost in the shadows. He gets lost in the gray. So a few more things quickly, and then I'll wrap up part 1. We'll come back in part 2 and talk about the incantatas. But also, as you're reading Benito Cereno, or as you're thinking about it, also think about the middle passage, which is the term that we give to the journey undertaken by slave ships going from West Africa to the Americas. So, of course, this is something that, historians deal with a lot. And the middle passage was, of course, a very traumatic, very tragic type of journey and type of space. But it's also frequently described as a liminal space, an in-between space. Kind of an in-between space for both the future masters and the future slaves. There was a lot of instability on board those slave ships. And one critic named Paul Gilroy calls them living microcultural, micro-political systems in motion. And of course, yes, the Africans were usually in chains. They were usually forced into, menial labor. They were kept below deck. Many of them died on the voyage because of inhumane conditions. But sometimes they took over the ship. And sometimes the white sailors needed the Africans not only to navigate some of those waters off the coast of West Africa, but also you would need at least 1 or 2 Africans so that you could be able to communicate with all of the other Africans, right? There was a major language barrier for the slavers, the white people going over there to acquire slaves, buying the slaves and transporting them back, and the Africans themselves. So again, we kind of see that with Babbo, right? Babbo is sort of the chief of the slaves. That's how he's described. He can speak for the larger group. He can speak Spanish, right? He might, I'm kind of forgetting now, but he might even possess some English as well. So he knows other languages, right? He can communicate with Don Benito, the captain of the ship, right? So the Spanish captain before his authority is usurped. So Babbo has this important role, and the white slavers would always need an African to fill that type of role, to serve as translator, to serve as a sort of cultural explainer, to help them understand how to manage these large groups of Africans that they were trying to force into servitude. So, yeah, slave ships themselves were very unstable, kind of gray areas. So it's no accident that Melville chooses one as a setting. And again, on this particular ship, we see this interchangeability between master and slave. And again, that's beyond Delano's comprehension. To Delano, white people are always in charge, and black people are always in a position of servitude. That's what he's used to. That's all he really understands. So it's just beyond him to understand that Babbo's in charge. Not Don Benito. Babbo. Babbo's calling the shots. Babbo is a stronger, smarter person than Don Benito. Okay? And that's just way over Delano's head, right? That's beyond his comprehension. But again, some critics find that this is really where Melville is making his strongest anti-slavery statement, by showing that there's no natural order to slavery in the Americas. There's nothing natural about white people always being the master and African people being in a position of servitude. It can just as easily be flipped around. It can just as easily be inverted to where the Africans have the power and white people are in a position of servitude. It can go either way. So if we accept that premise, then we kind of have to reject slavery and the kind of racist attitudes that governed America in the 19th century. Because if we acknowledge that there's nothing inherent, there's nothing natural, there's nothing scientific about whites up here and black people down here, then obviously the system is unjust. If there's no real justification for it, then it's unjust. It's wrong. And Melville doesn't come out and say that, but perhaps he shows that by showing Delano misunderstanding. And in the process, we see that Delano's misunderstanding stems from his racism, because he thinks that the American way is the natural way. But this ship shows us that it's not. Okay? Anybody who's strong enough and smart enough can take power. And in this example, it's Babbo and the Africans who do it, not the white people. But also, as we see with the events of the narrative, also slavery tends to destroy everybody involved, both the slaves, who often die from mistreatment, but also the slave owners. This was a common argument made during the 19th century by abolitionists. And you guys might be able to kind of see this because it's a pretty obvious logical move. They would argue that, hey, slavery is not just bad for black people, it's bad for white people too. It degrades white people. It makes white people morally corrupt. It brings us down a few notches. And that was often an argument made to appeal to people who were perhaps still in support of slavery or were still kind of on the fence. This idea that, hey, slavery is bad for everyone, not just the enslaved. And Melville might be making a similar point if you think about what happens to Don Benito and, of course, what happens to Babbo by the end. All right, so I'll try to wrap up very quickly. Again, just notice the sort of change in Delano's perception of Don Benito. He goes from first fearing the Spaniard, and that has a lot to do with sort of animus between English colonists and Spanish colonists that dates back centuries. So at first he fears the Spaniard, and then he pities the Spaniard, and then eventually he becomes kind of exasperated by him. He's so low energy and ineffectual. Delano, who's a real go-getter and so robust, he just can't really understand Don Benito. But he's very interested in Don Benito, right? He's constantly thinking and trying to figure out what's going on with Don Benito, but he's not all that interested in Babbo. He discounts Babbo. He notices him, and he's kind of complimentary of him, but only because he thinks that Babbo is a dutiful, loyal slave who's doing what black people are good at, in Delano's mind, right? So he doesn't realize what Babbo is capable of. He doesn't realize that Babbo is the most capable of everybody on board the ship. But again, this racism, these stereotypes that Delano subscribes to, they have real world consequences, right? They ensure that this revolt continues to be successful, at least up until the end. And at the very end, we get these legal depositions that conclude the tale. I know it might be tempting to just kind of skip over all of that and say, okay, that's boring, but I want you to make sure to read it because you'll notice some interesting things. Above all, Babbo is left out. Babbo's voice is excluded from all of that legal testimony at the end of the text. And it's also mentioned to us by the narrator that Babbo, after he gets apprehended, he refuses to speak. He refuses to speak to his captors. And apparently he continues to refuse up until he is executed. And make no mistake, again, this is based in history. Every leader of every slave insurrection that was ever put down in the U.S. was always executed, and usually done so in a public way, because it was thought that that would discourage future insurrections. So Babbo gets that same fate. But the narrator tells us that, again, he's told us a lot about Babbo that escaped Delano's perception, right? Babbo's brain, not his body, had schemed and led the revolt. I love that quote. It's his brain. No white people appreciate his brain, but it's his brain that made all of this happen. And they almost pulled it off against great odds. And again, in Melville's portrait here, Babbo does emerge as a fully complex human character. We might not think all of his traits are necessarily good, but again, wouldn't we perhaps resort to the same, wouldn't anybody perhaps resort to the same thing if put in Babbo's position? Yes, he and the fellow Africans resort to violence and sort of coercion, but what choice did they have? I mean, what recourse did they have unless they're just going to resign themselves to slavery? So again, Babbo shows himself to be very smart, very capable, and fully capable of using the master's own tools against them. But at the end, he has no voice. And I think we should notice that and think about that. He has, very little that he can do to sort of make a case for himself. So in some ways, not speaking is the only freedom that's really left to him. And remember, this is a character who refuses to be enslaved, right? But he also has no legal rights. He has no representation. He has nothing working on his side. No rights, no voice, no recourse. So the only thing he can really do at the end of the narrative is to choose silence. He chooses to remain silent. And in the process, he takes away the power of white people to misunderstand him, to misinterpret him, or to ignore him. Because one of those things would have happened if he did speak, if he did try to present his own side of the story. He would have been misinterpreted, he would have been misunderstood, and more often than not, he would have been totally ignored. So the only freedom left for him is to stay silent. And that's what he does. So I hope you guys enjoy the text. And again, if you didn't quite pick up on everything on your first reading, that's okay. That's very much part of Melville's design. Remember, he wants you to get beneath the surface to really get at the truth. So make sure you keep that in mind. And we'll come back in part 2 to talk about the incantatas.